I'm obviously not a palette knife painter. I love brush texture, but I have been using these for quite a while, over 30 years. And they're very handy once in a while. So I'll show you how I use them and some of the characteristics to watch out for when you're trying to decide what palette knives to choose. So, have fun! There are only a few key things to watch for when choosing palette knives. Make sure they don't twist easily in the handle. Don't be afraid to really put some pressure on them. They shouldn't turn at all.
Don't hurt yourself now. Can't do it.
The blade should be flexible and sharp so you can manipulate it a bit like a brush and lay in a nice sharp edge when you need one. Just don't cut your fingers when you're trying to clean that blade off. I prefer sharp-edged brushes and brush texture, but it's one of those things you'll want to experiment with. Richard Schmid loves his palette knife and achieves some spectacular roof edges and flower petals with them. If a blade is too wide and short, I don't have much use for it, like this one my daughter now plays with. Same thing with the blade that is so small. They're about half as wide as they are long and have very little flex to them. Not helpful for my painting methods at all. If the blades are too thin and flexible, they also tend to get dense easily, which happened to several I bought from Dick Blick. That's not to say they weren't good knives, just something to be aware of. I still have a couple from that set that are in good shape. Then again, I don't use them very much. If a blade is dented, it's useless as a painting tool. You can't be sure what kind of mark you'll get, and you want to be in control at all times. The main thing I use a knife for is mixing up sizable quantities of paint when I'm working on a large painting. And once in a while, I do a little mark in my paintings with it. This is my main knife now, since my favorite knife broke about 6 years ago. That was traumatic. It's a wonderfully strong knife while still being flexible. It's from Utrecht, and it's pretty old, so I don't know if they still make them as nice as this one. That angled edge, I've used a few times in 20 years. Definitely not essential, but it is a well-made knife. Sharp, flexible, and not so thin that it dents up just from looking at it wrong. This one is almost too long, but I prefer that to a blade that's too short. It just gets a bit unwieldy for delicate knife work. This is one of the few that hasn't been bent up. Okay, so I'm going to do a few techniques here with the palette knife, just to kind of show you some of the things that can be done with it, in case you want to try a sharper edge than what your brush might get you. Better get that farther in here so you can see what's going on. So let's say I wanted to create some highlights. So I just took some white and some cadmium lemon, and I'm going to create some brightly highlighted branches. So if I scrape this all in here, then I just get a little bit on there. Hopefully you can see the little ridge of paint right there. And I'm going to use just the edge of that on the painting. Let's say with some of the bigger branches in here, like this one right here. I can come in and just put in a small highlight branch right there as if the sun is catching on it. I'm not using the flat of the knife. I'm using just the edge and allowing the board, the panel, to pull the paint off of the side of the knife. And then I can't go and make another pass with that same stuff. I'd have to get some more paint on my knife. Another bit of ridged paint right there. And then I can come in and do the same thing. Add another bit of light-filled branch right there. I can also grab thicker amounts of paint and put in some leaves here and there. Well, those look more like branches. I'm going to get to my bigger knife that I'm more accustomed to using. I was trying to use a small, one of those flimsy Dick Blick knives, but they are pretty flimsy. So this one I can use much more easily, although this is a pretty hefty knife for general purposes. So let's say we just want to come right on the edge of one of those branches, lay in some paint. And then we can also take, let's say we had a whole section of branch where the sun was shining on it differently than the rest. We could come in and lay some paint in just like that. And then come back in with either softening out an edge by just kind of grabbing and then pulling up and dragging that so it breaks up that edge, or grabbing a paintbrush and then softening out an edge. Then we can take some of that yellow and mix up some more color and come in and gently lay in some other branches that are a little bit different value or color than the first batch of leaves. And then when I mix, I don't necessarily, it depends on what I'm doing. With some of it, I'll mix it very thoroughly. And at other times, I'll mix it so that you see a lot of striation and variation in the color form. That way I can come in and lay some color in there that's not uniform. And I can create some different values and colors with all in the same stroke. Often, when I do use a palette knife, I'll use it this way, where I barely mix it, and then I grab the paint. You can see the variety of color in there. It's not one uniform tone or color. And then I'll lay that in and move it. Then later I can come back in with my brush or with the palette knife again and break that up with some branches or with some other little bits of color, like a highlight or something inside of there to just break up that pattern. So the nice thing about a palette knife is I can grab a bunch of paint quickly, lay it in there, place a bunch on the panel, and then come back in with a brush or with the palette knife itself and manipulate that a bit. There are a lot of fun things you can do. Basically, it's just playing around with it and learning how your palette knife will work for you. But the key to all successful painting is to do it over and over and over again and just keep experimenting with it until you get it exactly the way that you want things to go. The nice thing about the edge of the palette knife is with a stroke like that, it cuts right through all those other layers without blending through. The bristles might end up picking up some of that and pulling them together, the different sides of the paint. With the palette knife, it just slices right through there and you can leave a nice little accent of color, either dark or light. So then if I want like a shadow on the bottom of one of these branches, I can come right in and just lay in a nice dark shadow. Pull that right across. So you see, I start to use, to an extent, when I'm doing it, I'll start using it like it's a brush, which is not a problem, as long as you know you can come back in and work with it. And that's the beauty of oil paint. So obviously I wasn't trying to create anything meaningful here, but it gives you an idea of the way to, same thing when I'm holding the palette knife, often I'm not holding it like this, like it's a baseball bat or a club or something. I'm holding it gently so that it can continue like we do with the paintbrush. It can just dance across there and pull that paint off of it. There we go. All right, so down here you can see how thin a line you can get with that. And you notice that with grabbing some paint on there, you can just gently pull it and curve that blade around in all kinds of different directions. And if I start to get out of control with the paint that's on here, I'll just wipe off my palette knife, get it a little bit cleaner. See, I can come right through there and leave a nice sharp line. And then as I'm moving, if I just tilt it down a little bit more, I get a bit wider stroke. Kind of straightforward that way. And if I want thinner, I keep more on the edge of the palette knife. So if I'm not getting the paint off of there that I want, I'll just keep turning it a little bit more till I see it grabbing the paint, and then pull back if I'm getting too much. Now, let's say this was the side of a barn roof. Our barn roof is blue. But we don't want our barn roof to be all rounded out like that. So we take our palette knife, get enough paint, you got to have plenty of paint on there so that your palette knife can get a hold of that paint. Okay, so then we come in, grab up some paint, so I've got it on the edge. Then I can come in here and a nice sharp line right there. So we do it to the top of the barn as well. Just like that, you can get a nice sharp edge, especially for man-made objects. Oops. Didn't want to do that one. There we go. Trying to get that weathered look in here. So there we go. Pretty quickly you can start to form these nice straight edges. Come over this side. Although that side would be dark, wouldn't it? Be a shadow side. Depending on where our light source is. So we can get a shadow side in over here. So there, you just keep playing with it that way. Come in here, create the other side of our barn. That. Afraid I didn't put enough paint on here to do a lot of this, sorry. There, that's how easily we can start to clean up the edges on here. Actually, we should probably do that darker right there, huh? All right, those are some of the ways that we can use a palette knife. So the main thing is to play with it, practice that curving of it, and placing it on there and then pulling and letting up again. And in no time at all, you'll have this down.